All right, for tonight's session of Personality Typology and Human Design, we will be looking at Alokanand Diaz. He was our chosen subject from last week. And so, if anyone, no one has submitted their type assessment of him. I did mine. If anyone happens to join and happens to come up with their own assessment, we can certainly see what they have to say. But my idea was, instead of just revealing it all at once, it would be to kind of go through the checklist, and I have the checklist here. I'll pull it up, and then look for different aspects of the checklist and kind of read through. I have this the 64 Gates, wonderful book, which is all transcriptions of him talking, so it's very true to how his thought process works. And I think that's very important when you are trying to type somebody, not to type something that they've prepared too much, but to actually be able to kind of see their cognition as it's happening in process. So here's the worksheet. We're going to start with observer versus decider. The observer-decider distinction is about getting stuck versus being judged. I see we're joined by Nancy. So we're going to be doing the worksheet for Alokanand Diaz. And I already have my conclusions here. If you have done your type assessment, feel free to share it in chat. Otherwise, I am more than happy to walk through my thought process. This was a hard one for me. This one actually was not easy. Some people are kind of obvious. This one, I would say I'm in the high confidence level, but I would certainly like outside independent assessment as well. A lot to see. Absolutely, Nancy. A lot to see there. A lot going on. I have my little autograph right there. Kind of sweet, when we met down in Costa Rica. So I already have my conclusions, but I'm just going to kind of start with reading some excerpts just to see if we can notice the way he talks and the way he describes. The first thing we're going to look for is observer versus decider. So if you have an open route, you're always in a hurry to get rid of the pressure, banging your head against so many things until you get depressed and you don't dare to move anymore. You get inactive. But not in a self-imposed or temporary state. You get inactive out of depression, or inactive because they put you in jail, or inactive because they close you up in a madhouse. If you don't know how to sit still, you're a carrier of this potent energy. All right, now I just picked a random part. These are not prepared, but already we see from here what we'd be looking for with the decider. At first, it kind of seems a little bit like decider. You don't dare to move. Like, you don't dare, you don't have permission to do it. You don't have permission, this or that, kind of, daring to this, daring to that. Kind of sounds like a decider thing, worrying about being judged, worrying about position. But then, worrying about if you're, just how you present yourself. But then he starts to say it's a self-imposed, or even you get inactive out of depression. He starts to talk quickly about what sounds to me like being trapped. I'm going to skip to the next page. If you don't know how to deal with depression, if you don't know the bright side of it, it can become a chronicle. So again, he's saying you can become trapped. It's out of repetition that depression becomes a habit. You just start to think that it's a habit. So, okay, so far, and this matches with what I think, I have him as an observer. Observers talk about being trapped. Both of the examples we just found randomly, he's talking about being trapped. He's saying if you don't realize it, it's a dead end, it's a trap. Observers use navigational language. They don't talk about what they're allowed to do as much. I'm not allowed to do that because it would be disrespectful to others, or they don't understand me. They don't see what I'm doing. There's not a lot of self-other talk. There's a lot of navigational talk. And so when you're looking for an observer, you're looking for, are they talking in terms of navigation, in terms of being trapped or being stuck, or things that won't work. I tried this, it doesn't work. It's a dead end. You'll just get stuck doing that. I'm an observer. There's you can start to notice observers. You can see I wouldn't talk about being allowed, or I wouldn't use words like opinion, judge, respect. Not very much anyway. I'm not as worried about being judged, and neither is alok. He is worried about being stuck. So let me see just a couple others. Let's see if I can just find. I'm trying to see when he's talking about himself. That would be the best. One of the hardest things for human beings to do is to learn to say no with a heart. A clear no with a heart. A no that does not damage your self-esteem. This theme of rejection is the deepest fear we carry in relationships. Well, this all sounds very much like Decider. But guess what? He's not including himself in that. He's saying, as an observer, I look out there and I see all these people and they have a hard time saying no because they have a fear of being rejected. And then he starts to say, what started happening to me was when I felt I needed a doctor because I couldn't keep listening, I felt so fake, I felt I was sick, so I started looking for something different. So he was saying that in his case, when he was living a lie, he started to make himself sick because he needed something different. And he even says here, if we're all in uniform, then what is there not to like if there's no other option? So he talks a lot in terms of options. Now, this could be a point for Decider, and I am open to being wrong. He could be a Decider, but at the end of the day, I put him as an observer because I saw that even when he talks about people who are afraid of being judged, he doesn't really include himself in that. He's more afraid of being trapped, and he talks a lot about, is there any other option? Is there any other way? It's very navigational. He's talking in terms of options. And this is about, he's talking about gate 4 here. These boys who feel rejected for being born poor when they see a rich girl, and they can't keep their self-esteem up and smile at her as an equal. Their consciousness does not allow it. This is class thinking. This is gate 4. Class thinking and patterns. All the rich are like this, all the poor are like that, all the women. It's the gate of cliches. This is what all men think about women, supposedly. What supposedly all women think about men. It doesn't exist, but you put the TV on and that's the kind of jokes you get served, the cliches. The only humor the not-self knows how to make. So, yeah. So he's asking, what is it to think like an individual, not like a poor or a rich person? What is it to think for yourself? So, yeah, and he's saying... he's talking about a lot of random things. He kind of keeps, there's a lot of what they would call leakage in the system, which is that while he's talking about one topic, a lot of other topics get in, and there are many of the things, not people. He starts to talk about airplanes flying into the Twin Towers. It shows you how illusory our control is. Look at the disasters of Katrina in the most wealthy country of the world, and we lacked resources to intervene. People and things were floating on the streets for a week before anyone came to help in the wealthiest country of the world. So he starts to kind of talk a lot about navigation and being trapped and being stuck. And can you imagine being trapped for a week with no resources and you're stuck in Katrina and you're helpless, trapped without anything you can do? These are all observer talk. So, and yeah, I see Nancy agrees. Observer is undefined G and manifestor trap. Well, yeah, that too, that the undefined G can feel so trapped, but I would almost say the observer with the undefined G feels stuck in a place. The decider with an undefined G has more people problems. So they have more of the existential question of who am I really? And the question about themselves in relation to others. Do I really have value for others, and so on? So it's kind of interesting. The same undefined G can play out differently with an observer versus a decider. And it seems to be more about place and being stuck somewhere and stuck in a job and stuck in a relationship for the observer compared to the decider, who it seems to be more about who are they really? Who are they and who is the other and what's me and what's you? And for the deciders, there's more of a melting or merging between self and other, so they don't really know who the other is and who they are. Like, is this really me or is this really you? The undefined G center connecting to a fault and mirroring the other. I think as a decider, it becomes so much more about people, and as the observer, it becomes so much more about place. Now, of course, these are two sides of the same thing. And the comment, he feels upset and empathetic about watching the world being trapped in the Wa. Absolutely. Always talks about that in terms of being trapped and stuck and people stuck in things and unable to go to the next place. Very navigational talk. I mean, at a high level, observers see the world of things and they see people as basically movable. People come, people go, people help, people hurt, people are good, people are bad. People are people. And a lot of observers will mistype themselves as deciders because they tend to think they have a lot of people problems, but actually they're very comfortable expressing negativity about people. Observers can express negativity easily about other people because they see people as fundamentally movable. What's not fundamentally movable is things. Things. You get stuck, you get trapped somewhere, you can't get out of it. So the observer is very much paranoid and anxious around being stuck or trapped because that is what they see as immovable. But it's very hard, and you can't always tell if someone's an observer or a decider just going by off what they say, because an observer will say, I have all these problems with my mom, and problems with my boss, and problems with my partner, and problems with my friend, and it'll seem like a decider because they have people problems. However, that's not the case. Deciders have a much harder time expressing negativity about people. They're worried about being judged. So the observer tends to be more, comfortable expressing negativity. The real problem the observer may have is that it's a thing problem. They want to go back to college, but they don't want to deal with all the bureaucracy and the paperwork, and they're blaming all these people for them being stuck. And so the whole stuckness is the observer phenomenon. And you were mentioning that he has gate 16 line 2 and base 4. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there's a version of each of these because there's somebody born 2 seconds after Alok who's a decider. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the observer version and what is the decider version? Because this is how the personality changes the body graph activations to fit its own preferences. My thesis is that the personality type does not change life to life to life. You have many different lives, you reincarnate, the personality crystal is the same, the personality is the same. It's very limiting, right? We're very limited by our personality. I guess you could say as an observer, I see us being stuck with our personality. We're not able to escape our personality. And so in his case, I think Alok is an observer and he has gate 16 line 2. Well, his version of that is going to be seeing people being trapped and seeing himself where he's been trapped and where he hasn't been able to do what he came here to do because he was stuck there. Somebody else with gate 16 line 2 is going to have a different version of that. The decider is going to be much more people oriented. So this is kind of my only point at this level. When we're determining whether someone's an observer or a decider, we don't necessarily want to take it at face value because the observer can complain about all these different people. I can't do this because my friend's getting in the way, my partner's getting in the way, and so on. But actually they're an observer because what they're really feeling is the stuckness, the trappedness, and they're feeling it because there's something they have to do, like go back to college. But they won't do it because they don't want to do the paperwork. There's a paperwork problem, and the real problem is around the things, not the people. In working with Alok, I saw this, again and again. We're both observers, and I could tell a fellow observer because we don't really have problems with people. Oh, this person doesn't like me. That's okay. Oh, they do like me. That's okay. They're giving me a compliment. Wonderful. They're giving me criticism. That's okay. We're basically okay about all of the range of people. At the end of the day, the real issues are thing issues. How are we going to do it? How are we going to get there? How are we going to make it happen? How are we going to move forward? What's blocking us? What's preventing us from moving forward? Anytime you talk about blockers, dead ends, trying to get to the next step, the next level, trying to see a way forward, how do we carve our own path? I'm on my own path. All of this is observer language. So I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, and I came down on the observer side for Alokanand Diaz. Now, what type of observer is he? We don't look at collaborator versus individualist here because that can kind of be confusing. There may be a secondary preference there, but that can just muddy things up. So because he's an observer, we just go in the left column here, gatherer versus organizer. Does he panic when he can't keep options open, or does he panic when things are not narrowed down to one option? Well, what we look for here is leakage. Gatherers have a lot of leakage. They're talking about one thing and other things get in. They bring other avenues. They bring other ways. There's a leakage where he begins to kind of, and so okay, so here's an example. He's in gate 59, the gate of sexuality, and he says, let's see. 59s are icebreakers. What are you doing, honey? They have this way of doing something that's a bit macho, but it's nice. They know how to be nice macho or a nice girl. It's a sexual strategy, a social strategy. It's a strategy for mating. It's a strategy to make friends. It's a strategy to break down barriers. This is the pattern of a gatherer because he's sharing what he has gathered. This is a report of all of the things he's gathered. I recognize this because I also am a gatherer. So when I talk about a gate, I share with you everything I've gathered. And it's kind of broad. I say, here are the many different things the gate can mean. He's saying it can be a strategy for mating. It can be a strategy for friends. It can be a strategy to break down barriers. He says he doesn't have gate 59. His only way to break down barriers is to yell, Wilma, open the door. Then he says he hates closed doors. That's why he doesn't knock on many. He doesn't like to meet resistance. Now, this is a gatherer because there's leakage of new things coming in, new things he's gathered, new things he wants to share. And an organizer isn't going to do this. They're going to want to close the loop and finish, and they do what's called chapter talking, where they basically finish one thing before moving on to the next. He sort of just keeps adding and adding and adding. He's gathered all these different things, and he just keeps piling them on and sharing them and saying, well, I've also gathered this, and here's something else it can be, and here's another thing, and here's another thing. So yeah, he goes on to say, he can be perfect for you if you want him. But if you don't want him in your kitchen, then don't take him home. Don't take him to your home and then start telling him all the things he can't do. No, if you don't want him to be the way he is, don't take him home. And then there are 59s that are much more gifted in relationships. They know how to break the ice. He doesn't. You give him ice, he wants to run away. He doesn't want to deal with ice. So he basically, he says, or if he does have to, he's going to melt them down too fast, just too much. So he really has a lot of gathering leakage, we could call it. It's the same with me. You were on my previous one, Nancy, and we started talking about the King Win sequence, and I wanted to just touch on it for a minute, and it ended up taking 15 minutes because I'm a gatherer. And as I was gathering and as I was trying to share what I'd gathered, I was caught off guard and I was confused. And then I kind of had to take this whole detour to get back to my original point. Organizers don't do that. They stick to the point, they stick to what they're doing, and they don't move on until they've completed or finished a chapter. It's kind of like a gatherer will compare and go back and forth between two different things. The organizer will just talk about one thing, conclude, have the final word, and then go on. In general, now this is not always, but most organizers kind of tend to do that. Now what we're really looking for is panicking when options aren't kept open or panicking when things are not narrowed down. So some people really freak out if there's too many options. They actually panic when there's too many options. In a relationship, if there's other potential mates around, they get really worried about the other person being around because, hey, my partner could run off with someone else. They have too many options. They actually will pick a partner who doesn't have a lot of options because that gives them comfort and makes them relax. A gatherer, on the other hand, likes to have the options, likes to have the freedom, even if they don't use it. So, yeah, and then, Nancy is saying she resonates with gatherer as well. Well, that remains to be seen because we still have to see. I mean, if you tend to report what you have gathered and tend to share the things you have collected, like the shiny objects that you like to show off to people, versus the organizer who wants to actually throw away a lot of unnecessary things and get rid of things and narrow down and then say, this is my favorite. So it's a little bit different, right? The gatherer kind of wants to share all the things that they've gathered. And in this case, I definitely think Alokanon Diaz is a gatherer. For you, it remains to be seen. I can see your argument that you might be a gatherer. Honestly, I think a great way to do it, if you have time, would be to contact the Cognitive Resolution Group. I'll share their link again here. Cognitive Resolution Group is fantastic. They do free personality typing assessment, and they assign you to a team, and one of these teams will assess you, and they don't know you. They simply look at a 40-minute video that you've recorded, and based on that 40-minute video, they try to come up with their best guess of what your personality type is. And these have been carefully assembled so that they contain one person from each quadra. So you have a real range of different personality types and cognitive functions for each team. So pretty cool group. You can see how to submit. When you submit for typing, you try to do at least 40 minutes. An hour is better. And you answer questions like, what is your typical day like? What is your relationship with your parents, siblings, and friends? Who are the 3 most important people in your life? Tell a story about your biggest struggles and accomplishments. What is most important? What are your priorities? And so on. And so as you do this, they'll look for certain things where if you're an organizer, you will tend to have chapter talking. And if you're a gatherer, you'll tend to have a lot of leakage. For what it's worth, I would have guessed you are an organizer. But by all means, you may be a gatherer. I don't, I stand corrected quite often in these cases. So I do think it'd be interesting to see if they see what I see, though, just because in observing your communication, I don't see a ton of leakage in the sense of like, I have a lot of leakage. Like the whole cognitive resolution group just leaked into this, right? I was talking about the difference in organizer and gatherer, and I'm like, oh, by the way, you can get a free type assessment if you connect with these people. That whole thing leaked in, and I suddenly had this whole new thing, just like earlier when the King Win sequence leaked in as we were talking about the 62 steps in the previous session. So in any case, as a gatherer, I deal with a lot of leakage. It's hard for me to stay on track. It's hard for me to do chapter talking where I finish a chapter before moving on to the next chapter. I have a hard time concluding. As you can see, even this chapter, which is the gatherer organizer chapter, I'm not really that good at like landing on a strong conclusion. I'm more just like, okay, here's a bunch of stuff I've gathered. This might help. Let's go to the next thing. So you can kind of see, yeah, you can see how I'm a gatherer in that respect. Okay, so going on to the next dichotomy, we have sensing versus intuition. And this one was really, really hard. This was probably one of the hardest. I actually discussed this with James Alexander. I discussed this with Michelle Schwab, who's staying here with me. I discussed it with Michael Steenbeck-Litvin. I see Monique just joined. We are typing Locanand Diaz, and we are going through the dichotomies. If you happen to have a type assessment for him, you can put it in the chat. If not, no worries at all. We're just kind of going through step by step. I have my full type assessment for him, but I want to save that for the end so that as we go through these dichotomies, you can perhaps ask yourself what you think he is. You can type along with me, typing him. And or you might, if you haven't done already, think what your own type is in this regard. And the dichotomies we went through, first of all, were observer versus decider. We decided or observed that we think, or at least I think, and I believe Nancy agrees with me, that Locanand Diaz is an observer because he gets really hung up on things, hung up on processing things. And he doesn't really have a problem processing people. He doesn't get stuck on people. He doesn't get stuck on what people think of him. He doesn't get stuck on waiting for permission or am I allowed to do this or a battle of opinions or any of that stuff. He doesn't even really get stuck on being respected or not. He really gets stuck on, well, feeling trapped or seeing when people are trapped or seeing the cages they've made for themselves or seeing when they aren't able to get to the next step in their life. And observers use so much navigational language. I believe that Alok is an observer. Next, of what kind of observer he is, we think he's a gatherer because he gathers a lot of things like I do. I'm also an observer and also a gatherer, and he shares what he has gathered. But here's our first big difference: sensing versus intuition. And this is something that I had to think quite a bit about because I really wasn't sure in the beginning. It's not like I immediately had some intuitive hit, like knowing what he is. Intuition is what I do. I give an overview. And so even like you just joined, I just did an overview of what observer versus decider are. Then I did an overview of what gatherer organizer. I would even give an overview of what sensing versus intuition is. These little descriptions here are overviews. Sensing is proof and reality ensures clarity. Intuition is an overview of what is happening that ensures understanding. I do not believe that Alok gives overviews. It's funny because when I said that he's on the side of clarity, there was some disagreement in the people I talked to. They said, Alok is not clear. And I said, oh, yes, he is. And then, so let's just read a little bit. Okay, he's talking about gate 59. If you read the 6 lines of this gate, the first line is called the preemptive strike, the caveman strategy. It is an easy one. You hit them on the head and pull them to the cave. Explain later when the baby is there. Do you want to go out with the baby? And she gives you that look like son of a bitch. Yeah, but I am your son of a bitch. Okay, doesn't seem very clear, right? At first, it doesn't seem clear, but I actually think this is clarity. This is clarity. And it's clarity because he cares more about, how do I explain this? He doesn't care as much about you understanding him, and he's not as anxious to make sure you understand him. It's actually the lack of overview that can be unclear. See, this is a language issue. People will say that that's unclear. It's not. It's very clear what he's saying. He's talking about an example of a caveman who hits the woman, and you know, the woman's mad at him, and he's like, yes, but I'm a tough guy, but I'm your tough guy. And it's like, it's very clear what he's talking about. He doesn't give you an overview. You don't understand what the whole gate is about. You don't understand why it's relevant. You don't understand why this is the first line process fitting into a larger process. There's no overview that shows you where you are on the map. So this is a little bit tricky, right? Because clarity versus understanding. I'll use myself as an example. I am an intuition guy, and all the intuition people have a real problem of not being clear. I can be very unclear, like I don't spell things out. I assume that you will know what I'm talking about, and that might be wrong. And I've been really surprised because I've assumed that I've conveyed information to someone. Turns out I was totally unclear. Like if I'm hanging out with someone and I kind of want them to get the message, I'm not going to spell it out. I'm just going to kind of hint at it and hope that they pick up on the hint. Alokanan Diaz is not a hint guy. He's a spell it out guy. He's a, look, I am bothered that you did this. I would appreciate if you don't do that again. This has to happen there. I'm not doing this until we have clarity. Basically, it takes responsibility for ensuring clarity, but he does not take responsibility for ensuring understanding. In fact, he doesn't even notice if you don't understand. I notice and I go, okay, this person's not quite getting it. I'm going to try another tack. And I come up with another example. Okay, they're still not getting it. I'm going to have another example. They're still not getting it. Another example. He doesn't do this. There's a debate or a thread on the personality typology forum about sensing versus intuition. And there was a sensing woman talking about how her husband is intuitive and how frustrating it is because she wants him to be clear. And he'll say, okay, imagine you're on a boat and you're going down the river. And she says, no, no boats, clear. And he goes, okay, imagine you've built a house, but you've built the house with wood and a big wind is coming. And she goes, no, I don't want any metaphor. What are you saying? And he's like, okay, imagine this, imagine that. He's trying every different example. Now it sounds a little bit like what Alok is doing, but it's actually much more what Ra does. I believe that Ra, hopefully this won't give away too much of my typing of him, but I believe Ra is intuitive and, Alok is sensing, and this is one of the big divides between them. And the divide between them is that Ra has a deep understanding and many different ways to convey that understanding, but he's totally unclear. People complain about Ra's lack of clarity all the time because he doesn't really spell things out. He just makes so many assumptions. And most of his business problems were because of a lack of clarity. He trusted somebody without spelling it out. Sensing needs to have the agreement. It needs to have the technical contract, and it can even be a little bit overly technical, overly legalistic, in the sense that they'll do something that violates the spirit of the contract, but because it wasn't explicitly forbidden, they use that as a justification. See what I'm saying? The intuitive believes more in the spirit of the contract. The sensing person wants more of the clarity. They look for any ambiguity and try to eliminate ambiguity. I can tell you that if I'm getting booked for a conference, my biggest question is about the spirit of the conference and the overview of what is happening, and I want to make sure we have an understanding. that I have an understanding with the other person. And beyond that, I don't discuss the details. I don't discuss how much money. I don't discuss where I'll be staying. I don't discuss the timing. I assume it will all be taken care of. I don't discuss if I'll get a ride from the airport. I don't discuss if how much money I get per day for food or what the diet is. I just assume it'll work itself out. That's because I'm intuitive. Alokanand in that same situation requires clarity on each and every one of those things I mentioned. He doesn't even have the overview of what's happening. He doesn't even understand the context of what's happening quite often, but he does want to know exactly when he'll be picked up at the airport and dropped off and for how many days and where he'll stay and what, and on and on and on. Every little sensory detail. Now, there's a great advantage to the sensory as well. They don't have a lot of surprises caused by miscommunications by assuming that each other are going to do something. Me and Richard are both intuitive. We come to an understanding. When we meet to talk about signpost, we talk about the direction that signpost will go. And we'll say, okay, instead of trying to get more paid subscribers, we're going to try to do more content on the website or something like that, right? We're going to change the direction of our focus. That's what intuition is doing. It's basically making sure that we understand each other and we understand what we're working on. However, a lot of the details, I might assume he's going to do it, and he assumes I'm going to do it, and it doesn't get done because there's no clarity about the division of labor. It's very ambiguous. That's how intuitives work. We have a very high threshold for ambiguity. When James Alexander came to live with me, we had an understanding. We like each other, we're friends, and he said, oh, I'd love to rent a room from you. And I said, that's great. And then we just worked out the details later. And for the first month, we didn't even talk about how much the rent would be or any expectations we have of each other. We just have an understanding. The understanding is the details will work themselves out in the future. Well, I had a sensory friend come stay with me, and the moment, I think I used this example last week, the moment she came, she wanted to know exactly what day she could move in, exactly what day to move out. She paid me the money the same day, knowing exactly the rate. Everything had to be clear. So even though it sounds unusual because, Alok doesn't always seem clear, I actually think he is clear, and that what we pick up on sometimes is a lack of overview and a lack of understanding that makes people go, wow, where did that come from? That came out of left field. Like, he doesn't really explain his rationale sometimes. He doesn't really explain why. Like, he'll start talking about a gate and you're like, wow, this is so profound. He's really like getting at this amazing description of the gate. And then he'll say something that seems totally random and bizarre. And you're like, why would he say that? There's no explanation. There's no answer of why. Intuitives are always trying to look for the why, because the why is what helps you really understand. If you know why he said it, then you understand and you could say something else, right? You can produce the same kind of knowledge that he produces because you know why. But if he doesn't tell you why, you're just left with this insight and you have no idea where the insight came from. And that is why he is on the sensing side. And in fact, I think that is a big part of his teaching style that can make him so effective in certain ways, but also some people have a really hard time understanding him. And he doesn't notice or care that they don't understand because sensing is not responsible for others' understanding. Sensing is responsible for being clear. He will even say, do I make myself clear? That is a sensing statement. I would never say, do I make myself clear? I would say, hey, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Let's take a step back and let's see if we can reach an understanding. So I'm an intuitive, Ra was an intuitive, Mike's an intuitive, James Alexander's an intuitive. A lot of human design people are intuitives. I think that the sensory ones actually have a lot to give because so much of human design, because it's been overly intuitive, is really unclear. It's really unclear what Ra means by the word projector. It's really unclear what he means by initiating and waiting to respond sometimes. It's really unclear what he means in all of these different cases, and it's hard to clarify. It's not hard to understand, but it's hard to clarify. So these are two different processes. I do think this is one of, Alok's great gifts, but it's also led some people who've learned from him to say, wow, I didn't understand any of where he got that from. I have no idea. Like, everything he said was really profound, but I have no idea why he said it. I have no idea what it has to do with the gate he was talking about. He did an amazing reading for this person, but I have no idea why he got this from those channels or those centers. With Ra, you always know exactly why he said it. Oh, you have an undefined solar plexus. You're avoiding confrontation and truth. Perfect. We know why because we understand the mechanism, we understand the why of the centers. With Alok, he may have a deep understanding, but it's not his responsibility to convey that understanding or to make sure you understand. He only takes responsibility for being clear. Let's see, another random part. Here he's talking about gate 57, and they say our survival depends on God, that we live in the grace of God. The 57 says, then why do I have to be afraid all the time? Why do I have to look when I cross the street? Why doesn't God do that for me? It doesn't make sense if there's a God that we have to be afraid. And why doesn't it make any difference? This is gate 57. Why doesn't he or she or whoever it is do something when people die? Well, he's not explaining what that has to do with gate 57. I can piece it together a little bit that gate 57 is a fear gate, but I mean, literally, he just starts talking about it, and then he begins to say, gate 57 is the one that questions, if God is real, then why do I have to look both ways when I cross the street? This is clarity, not understanding. See? It's kind of funny because that distinction can be hard to notice because intuitives like me will say, that was really unclear. But what I really mean is, I don't understand why he said that. And then sensing types will say the same thing about intuitives. They'll say, wow, I didn't understand anything of what the intuitive said. What they really meant is that there was no clarity there because they actually may understand more than they realized because the intuitive has given them a deeper understanding that is not so obvious. Like if you read enough Ra, listen to enough Ra lectures, you get a pretty deep understanding of human design. But there can be a lot of areas that are really unclear. And that's the distinction. So I put Alok on the sensing side. Now this one was also one that was much harder for me, feeling versus thinking. And at first I thought he might be feeling because I thought this guy is pretty good at synchronizing with people. But then I thought back to experiences I've had, and this is harder to see from a book like this or from his interviews, but interpersonally, he's definitely on the thinking side, and I'll explain why. Feeling really wants to synchronize, and it's very uncomfortable if you're in a room with people and you're not all on the same page in sync. Thinking is much more comfortable, live and let live, do your own thing, be yourself. We don't have to all come together. So it's more comfortable with many different conversations happening, things like that. Now, this is something that I only know about him because I know him personally and I've met him a few times and spent a couple weeks with him and so on. And what I've noticed is that Alokanand will not attempt to get everybody to synchronize with him. He allows people to have their own conversations and he kind of does his own thing. And in fact, even in a small group, if it's me and him and two other people, he doesn't even try to maintain the group cohesion of the penta. He's almost like part of his anti-penta, anti-Wa thing, I believe, is thinking preference. Because, again, you can have any human design body graph and any personality combined. And so somebody with the exact same body graph as him who has a feeling preference isn't going to have the same problems he's going to have. Thinking people get very stuck on getting things done and very stressed out and personally responsible to get things done, and they don't care as much about being on the same page. They basically just assume, well, we'll get on the same page eventually, it'll all work itself out. I'm a feeling person, I assume that about the job. I assume, the work will get done eventually, no big deal, let's just wait for the work to get done. What we really have to make sure is that we're all on the same page. So what I've noticed is, even in a small group with Alok, he will break off from the group to have a private conversation with him and one other person in a way that feeling types experience as quite rude, because we go, wow, we were all having a conversation together and you just kind of snubbed us and broke off to have a one-on-one conversation with someone else, and now you guys are like whispering to each other and kind of having a personal conversation, and it's kind of uncomfortable because we're like sitting 3 feet apart from you and we were all having this conversation together. And now we're left to just talk to each other, I guess, because it's kind of like, It's like we're in the middle of talking, and then it's like, yeah, it's funny that he just said that. Do you notice that the way he said it is that blah blah blah? And you're kind of like, where the hell did that come from? We were all in a group, we were all on the same page, and now you're splitting off to talk randomly to somebody else and kind of ice out the other people in the group. This is what he does, and this is a thinking thing. I've noticed this again and again. It's not a manifester thing. This is why it's important to learn personality type if you really want to overcome some of these biases, because otherwise you might assume that it's a manifester thing. Well, it just happens that, Alok is thinking, and thinking people don't feel personally responsible for keeping everyone in sync. They feel personally responsible for getting whatever has to get done. And they get stressed out when it's not done. So I can say in talking to him, he's very much stressed if the streaming isn't working. He's stressed if the laptop won't connect right. He's stressed out if he has to get a bunch of work done for the next day. I don't get stressed about things not being done. I'm on the feeling side. I get stressed when there's crosstalk and people aren't on the same page, and someone's sitting there really bored and nobody notices they're bored except me, because I'm feeling and I'm making sure that they're included, and they're bored and that person's angry and this person's sad and we're all out of sync. Other people are laughing and having a good time. It's like I want us to all come together and be on the same page to have a shared experience. You'll also notice that thinking people are very disruptive to shared flow. Like you'll be watching a movie, they'll show up 30 minutes late, they'll start asking what happened, they'll get bored in 20 minutes and leave. And it's very disruptive. There's no synchronization or commitment to the entirety of the experience happening, right? And so at first it seemed that, Alok was probably feeling, because I thought, wow, he has such a good vibe and he's a great job at making a vibe, but he doesn't consider himself responsible for the vibe. Other people are responsible for the vibe. He's responsible to get it done. So on his retreat, his responsibility was making sure that his lectures were great, that they were all finished, that they were making sure they covered all the bases and doing everything that needed to happen, and making sure the streaming is working, and making sure the computer is set up right, and the projector is good, and the lights are down, and making sure there's enough chairs, and making sure everything gets done. But sometimes it would actually be a kind of a bad vibe. And he was basically just like, well, that's up to you. If it's a bad vibe, that's your responsibility. You need to take care of your own vibe, was kind of his attitude. Now, as a feeling person myself, I take personal responsibility for the vibe, and I want to make sure everybody's having a good time, and I want to make sure we're all connected, we're all included. He was basically like, free to be you and me. And that's a very thinking attitude. They each have an advantage. I don't mean to badmouth thinking. Thinking has a great advantage of just allowing people to do their things. I mean, feeling can come across really controlling. It can be like, now let's all stand in a circle and go around talking about, what we're grateful for. That's a total feeling thing. It's aimed at getting everybody in sync. Thinking people hate that stuff. They're like, oh my God, I have to be in sync with all these people. Won't they just let me be myself? Won't they just let me come and go? Won't they just let me interrupt the middle of their private conversation and then leave 5 minutes later? Well, that's a thinking thing. They're not bothered by people doing that with them, so they don't think others should be bothered when they do that. See what I'm saying? So it's really at an ultimate level, it's about what are they responsible for? Are they responsible for making sure it happens, or are they responsible for keeping everybody on the same page? Alok is definitely responsible for making sure it gets done, and he gets really stressed if something gets in the way of that. I'm a feeling type. I don't get stressed when something gets in the way of that. I don't get stressed if something has to be canceled or moved or changed, or if the streaming goes down, or if it takes 2 hours to set up the microphones with some weird arcane system. None of that bothers me. I keep my cool. What really infuriates me is if there's a great vibe and we're in the middle of it, and then people come in and interrupt to kind of be looky-loos and then leave 20 minutes later. It's like that they don't realize that their freedom of interrupting things is actually breaking the harmony and breaking the synchronization of the group. And I prefer synchronization. This is not because I'm a generator. It's not because of 2946 or 952 or any of that. It's literally because I have a feeling preference. And him interrupting things, you might say, well, that's a classic manifester. Yes, he has the energy to do that as a manifester, but a feeling manifester is not going to. They're going to use their power to impact, to get everybody on the same page. Brandy Jordan, Brandy Wisdom Keeper, she is a feeling manifester. She's always like, okay, everybody, we're coming together. We're all going to get on the same page now. Sit down and close your eyes. Start doing this meditation. She will use her manifestor power to get everybody on the same page. Alok will use his manifestor power to interrupt and then leave when he wants. One isn't good and the other bad. It's simply two different preferences. The feeling people are really bothered when people are out of sync and there's a lot of interpersonal chaos, and they're really bothered by the interruptions of people who won't commit to stick around in a group long enough for the chaos to subside, to be in sync, and for the vibe to build. The thinking person wants the freedom to come and go. Like, I tried to get all these people to not interrupt. I said no late entry to talks last year at HDHD and no early exit. I was like, only come to a talk if you want to stay the whole time. Because guess what? It's really disruptive if people start leaving 40 minutes into a 50-minute talk. It really breaks the last 10 minutes of the talk. It screws it up. It's really obnoxious. Well, the feeling people have no problem with that. They're like, we get it. We want to be a part of this thing from the beginning to the end. The thinking people are like, why is Jonah controlling me? He can't control me. I'll do what I want. I'll leave when I want to. I'll show up when I want to. I'll arrive and leave with no regard for whether I'm interrupting the synchronization and vibe of a group, because they don't care about that. It doesn't bother them. If they're sitting in a movie theater and somebody starts flipping through their phone, they don't even notice. They don't even care. It's like a free to be you and me thing. If I'm sitting in a movie theater in a dark room watching and somebody starts flipping through their phone, I'm like, would you please stop doing that? Usually I don't even say it because that's too much clarity. I usually just say, excuse me, or, I intuitively kind of push them. But as a feeling person, I make it my personal responsibility to keep people on task. And that is part of the synchronization. I can't stand the random chaos of coming and going and people showing up late and all the different things. It's just like feeling people like to be in sync. They like to maintain synchronization with others. And, it's really hard for them when there's a lot of chaos, and it can feel really controlling to the people who are being chaotic, because the feeling person is like wanting to get them all in sync, and the thinking person has more of the attitude of, let me be myself. Let me come and go when I please. Let me do my own thing. And that is definitely Alok. He is definitely on the thinking side, where it doesn't really bother him people showing up late or coming and going randomly. It doesn't really disrupt his flow. He kind of just ignores it. And but what he is really bothered by is if he can't get something done. Okay, so the next one I have is sleep versus play. Sleep is pre-processed info. It does not stray from what is known. Play talks things out and discovers while talking, learning as they go. So here's Alok, random page, talking about transformation. Transformation is making a difference with your life. This idea of leaving a better world than we found it. It's not better, it's prettier. It's not better, it's just prettier. That's what we're here for. We're here to realize how beautiful it all is. We're here to go, wow, is this all for me? Yes, yes, Alice, welcome to Wonderland. It's all for you. This is play, classic play. He hasn't worked out the example with Alice ahead of time. He hasn't worked out. He's like making these realizations in real time. I also have play, so I haven't picked this page ahead of time. I'm turning to a random page, and then I'm talking things out and discovering as we go and learning as we go. So he's definitely on the play side of the dichotomy. He strays a lot from what is known. He strays from his pre-processed info and improvises and conjectures in real time. Next, taking in for the self, consume, new experiences, new information, new concepts, doing things for yourself, taking in new for the self, sharing known information with others, and controlling others. Well, you would think blast, but actually he's not sharing a lot of known information. Sharing known information would be sharing the keynotes. He doesn't really share the keynotes much. Every now and then he'll throw in a keynote, but it's a lot of new information that he's improvising. How did you make all that money? Did you work for it? They don't tell you that. No. How did you make it? How many have suffered for you to be successful and to be that generous with humanity? Aren't you washing off dirt? You built a hospital to save lives, but how many have you killed? How much money did you invest in warfare, and then you build the hospital? This is not known information. This is improvised new information. You can also, now he's teaching in this mode, so he's doing more of like a consume report. He's like reporting on everything he's consumed. Well, I read this and I read that, and I had this thought and this connection. He's kind of like reporting everything he's gathered. But he hasn't narrowed it down to say the fundamental essence of gate 14 is blank. Instead, he's kind of reporting everything he's consumed, and then he's improvising with a lot of play. He also is reluctant to control others. Blast has no problem saying, pass me that, go over there, do this, do that. Like like Blast will tell people what to do. He actually doesn't tell people what to do. He's very live and let live, very laissez-faire, just be yourself, free to be you and me kind of thing, like that, like from the thinking dichotomy. And he will do things for himself. He will consume. This is something that you might not see from his books, but he does a lot for himself. Like, he will get up and then go smoke a cigarette and enjoy his own alone time, and then he'll go explore and do something, take in something new just for him. Go get a coffee for him. Like, a high consume person has no problem going across town to get a meal for themselves. Someone who has low consume or consume last, they are very reluctant to actually do something nice for themselves. They don't want to like drive across town to buy the thing for themselves. They need to either get someone else to do it, controlling the tribe, or they need to justify it by bundling it together with other tasks. But they won't really do things for themselves. I see him as a high consume person, although I do believe consume and blast are kind of in the middle for him. And we'll see his actual type when we finish this checklist. And you'll see that that's the type that I landed on for him. So it's not that he won't blast, he just has blast and consume kind of in the middle with a slight consume preference. Feminine DE and masculine DE. This one was also a little difficult for me because feminine DE we see as very sensitive and careful in how it communicates and tries to word things correctly in a way that avoids conflict. Masculine extroverted deciders, which is how we communicate with others by kind of collaboratively, I guess you could say, is straightforward, blunt, and straight from the hip. Now, at first, it seems like he's masculine DE because you go, isn't this guy kind of rough on people? Isn't he kind of harsh? Doesn't he just say, look, this person's an asshole and that person's a jerk and aren't they this and that? Yes and no. Yes and no. If you actually speak with him, or when I've heard like voice memos from him and so on, he's always like, he's very careful about what he says. He's very thoughtful and eloquent. I actually have him as feminine DE. And again, we can't conflate this with having a defined solar plexus. People with a defined solar plexus can still avoid conflict in their language, even if their energy is willing to confront. But it will confront delicately. He would say, Jonah, this is a very delicate matter. We must be careful about how we proceed because we do not want to give the wrong impression or the wrong idea about how it is, this and that. That is feminine DE. Feminine DE, even if he can be blunt, even if he can be direct, is very eloquent and using language in a sensitive, careful manner. How do I word this right? How does this appear to others? How do I say this in a way that isn't going to give the wrong impression or hurt them? Masculine DE is much more blunt and much more direct. So I don't think he actually is a straightforward, blunt person. I think he's actually much more careful about how he words things. So like here he's talking gate 28. It sounds so brave, but in truth it's silly. It's really silly because from the perspective of gate 28, it's not like you can avoid risking. Risking is not an expression of its will. Risking is an expression of its recognition. And its recognition that it is already at risk. This is feminine DE. I have feminine DE. Ra had feminine DE, I believe. You know, James Alexander has feminine DE. Mike has feminine DE. God, we need some like women examples. Brandy Jordan has feminine DE. Feminine DE comes across as very intelligent and sophisticated in how it communicates a lot of the time. One example of someone who has masculine DE is Von Paul. And if you've seen any videos with Von or heard him talk or heard him describe things, he doesn't really worry about how to phrase it. He doesn't really think a lot about how it's going to come across or how it's going to appear. He worries more about if what he's saying is accurate. People who have feminine DE can sometimes be inaccurate or even deceitful, deceptive, because they are covering up how they really feel because they're trying to sugarcoat it and use a lot of softeners. There's something called softeners in language. And if you look for softeners, Alok uses a lot of softeners. He says it could be, not it is. He says it might be, it might, maybe, could be this certain way in a certain situation. Those are all softeners, just like I use. Von Paul, masculine DE, does not use softeners. And if you hear him talk, he'll just say, I was with the guys and we went to the place and we did the thing and we went here. And he's not really softening it all up, saying, we considered that it might be a good idea to go to the place. He's just like, we went there. He doesn't, use a lot of softeners to kind of fatten up the language. So I have Alok perhaps surprisingly as feminine DE. I think some people would probably type him as masculine because they would imagine what a blunt guy. He's not actually that blunt. He's actually very careful and very sensitive about his communication. Here we have feminine versus masculine sensory. I am masculine sensory. I have a strong orientation in space and time and a strong spatial timeline. I do not necessarily have the same visual concepts thing that feminine sensory people have. This was a little tricky for me, and I kind of went back and forth on this one as well, but I do think there are some telltale signs of feminine sensory for Alok. I do think he's a little bit more understanding about timing. He's more understanding about things running late or ending early. I have masculine sensory. I start right on time every time. Doesn't matter if anyone's here or not. I just start at the time. And if somebody is here, I definitely don't say, let's wait for some more people to gather, because waiting for more people to gather is really disrespectful for the people that came on time. People who have feminine sensing, like Mike, he was supposed to start Zeitgeist at 10 a.m. and then he changed it to 10:30. Then he plays songs at 10:30 and sometimes he's on at 10:42. Like, I go on right at noon for my time. Sometimes he's done by 3 minutes before, and there's just like dead space. And it's really annoying to me because as a masculine sensing person, I have a very strong sense of time. And I also set alerts and set, reminders for myself. It's not like I just instantly know the time. I set alerts, but I'm very cognizant of the time and very time aware and kind of aware of not going over time too much and trying to start on time and all of these things. He has a much different relationship to time, and he also uses a lot of visuals and has a very visual sort of understanding, which I just associate with feminine sensing. There might not be examples of the feminine sensing in this book, but I do believe he has feminine sensory. So I would actually put his type code as FF. And there are some other cues that I use for that as well. Finally, is he info dominant or is he energy dominant? And this is one where, hold on a second, I'm going to find his type twin. This is one that was also a little tricky for me. Does he respect his energy levels? Or is he like me? I'm info dominant. I don't respect my energy levels. I could be so tired, but I want to share the information so much that the information exchange is more important to me than the actual energy level. At the end of the day, I believe that he is energy dominant. So I put him as energy dominant because I noticed that he does respect his energy level, and if people are going out at night and he's tired, he doesn't care. He's just going to stay in. And if he's worked really hard throughout the day, then he's going to rest at night. Something you notice is that energy dominant people, for example, James Alexander, he, being energy dominant, will work consistently every day. But then he consumes information in swings. So he doesn't read every day. I mean, I guess maybe he does a little, but he doesn't consume a lot of information on a daily basis. He simply does a lot of work and spends a lot of energy, goes to the gym and goes and does errands and does all these different things where he's very active. And then by the evening, he's more respectful of his energy levels and he doesn't have energy to do a lot of things. And he's resting. So he works and then he rests and he works and he rests. I saw this with Alokanan Diaz as well. Mike is info dominant like me. I'm info dominant. We tend to consume information regularly, but we work in swings. So we don't do the work, and then for 3 days straight, we work like crazy. Info-dominant people have massive energy swings where they do a ton of energy work. They use a lot of energy and get a lot of stuff done, but they bundle it all together. Alok was much more consistent where he had a regular daily schedule of using his energy and then resting, using his energy and then resting. And so I do have, yeah. And then would energy be dominant be more of a defined ego? No, not at all. I mean, he has a defined ego and James does, but there are just as many people, probably 50-50 down the middle, who are info dominant who have defined ego. So we have to always remember that there is literally no relationship whatsoever between the body graph and the personality. Like when Ra says that the personality has no connection to the form, this is what he means. Like the personality is completely disconnected from the form, and this is why we can get into so much trouble, because somebody with a defined ego is going to say, I'm living my design and I'm an energy dominant person and I'm respecting my energy level, and you have, you're not respecting your energy level, therefore that's your not self. It's not true. I'm trying to think of, and oh, who's info dominant with a defined ego is Ra. Ra was info dominant. Ra had no respect for his energy levels. He would absolutely work crazy hours and he would consume information every day, but then have huge energy swings where he would go into his room for like 3 days straight and use all of his ego energy to just use tons of energy all at once and then not use the energy the rest of the time. So you'll see that energy dominant people have a very regular use of energy and an irregular use of information. Ra, like me, was info dominant. So he respected the exchange of information and he did not respect his energy levels. He would work crazy hours. He would lecture for 6 hours straight. He would have all sorts of crazy swings where he would spend days on end, working super hard and then resting after. And he had a defined ego. So, again, we need to see that there's two versions of each of these and that the personality is going to kind of have its preference totally separate from the body graph. And we need to make sure not to confuse those two. So at the end of it, we have Alokananda Diaz, observer, gatherer, sensing, thinking. ST, he's a reporter. ST people are really good at reporting what's happened. Play, consume. Consume, play person. Takes in a lot for himself and talks things out, learns as he goes. Feminine DE, feminine sensory. Double feminine, the FF type code. And energy dominant, respects his energy level, has a continuous kind of regular use of energy, but an irregular exchange of information. Now, he is a different social type. We have not covered his social type here, but besides the social type, his 512 match, there's only one who's been officially typed, and it is Bryan Cranston. Now, he is I think, the exact opposite social type, so I know we haven't gone into social types here, but you might see some pretty big differences between Bryan Cranston and Alokananda Diaz simply because Bryan Cranston, I believe, is friends first. He's listed here as a social 4. Friends first people truly want to learn from others and will easily move for others and live for the basic human need of connection with others. Their polar opposite social type is called the social 1, and the social 1 has the least amount of wanting to learn from other people, the least amount of desire for connection with others, and the strongest need for significance. They want to be significant in the world. So I believe that Alokananda is a social 1, and as you can see, these are not his type, of course, but social 1s can be very intimidating, powerful, commanding, self-confident. They don't take any guff from anyone. They don't have any, they don't suffer fools lightly. They're very independent. They learn on their own. Yes, he learned from Ra, but he mostly learned on his own. He said that actually he really was able to take the information and kind of go his own ways with it. And he actually came to his own conclusions. For instance, he tells a story about how when Ra had told him he's a beer, not a doer, and he went ahead doing anyway because they had the wrong birth time for him, and he just knew that he was a doer, and that is a manifester, would later be called a manifester. So that's an example of his flex. He didn't wait for someone to tell him, you're a doer. In fact, Ra told him the opposite, and he's like, Ra doesn't know. And then he just went on, he trusted himself more than someone else there. So this is just to say that when you look at all of these flex people, they're all very self-confident, very driven, very kind of hard-edged, very tough. They all are real survivors. They just have a certain look to them, a certain confidence to them, and a certain independence. And they all are searching for the basic human need of significance, of being significant people, being important people. When you look at the social fours, these people are looking for connection, and they just want to have a good time and hang out with friends, and they just want to, learn from other people, and they're much, considered friendlier, easier to get along with, less polarizing. They're all kind of like relaxed, laid back people. And so Bryan Cranston, I believe, is the exact personality type, the 512 type, FFSETE. That's a double feminine, sensing, thinking, play, consume, sleep, blast, gatherer. I do think that is the correct type code that we have for him. But I think this is the exact opposite social. That Bryan Cranston does not really care about being famous or building his empire. He's not an empire builder. Bryan Cranston isn't. He's just looking for the basic human need of connection and wanting to learn from other people. Alok Anand Diaz, I believe, is the social one, which is what's called the flex type, not the friends type, where he's constantly flexing his muscles, flexing his strength, flexing his power. Now, just as a side note here, he has a defined ego, so you might say, well, easy for him to be flex. It's not a defined ego thing. I have an undefined ego, and I'm a social one. It doesn't mean it's my not self for having a goal of building an empire and being a dominant, powerful, confident person. You can have all of those traits and have an undefined ego. It's the personality that we're talking about, not the form. The form, the defined ego, has more to do with how much energy you have to stubbornly hold on to your desire and get your way. I have an undefined ego. I have very little energy for that, so I just do something else when I don't get my way. I don't even have a way some of the time, right? It's just kind of like it's not a thing for me because I don't have a lot of energy to persistently, stubbornly hold on to my desire in that way. So the defined ego can go either way. There's no way to predict if someone's going to be friends or flex. We covered the social types a little bit 2 weeks ago, and I think it's a little too much to dive into the social types now, but I'm happy to go into them again next week. The short of it is that there's two dichotomies, flex versus friends. If you're a flex person, you're an empire builder and you just have this strong drive to sort of dominate and take leadership positions and things like that. If you are a friends person, you tend to shirk leadership roles and you tend to look more for connection and learning from other people, moving for other people, doing things for others, and so on. I think Alok is flex. And so that's one of the differences between him and Bryan Cranston. And then the second one is generalist versus specialist. A generalist will take responsibility to do everything themselves, and a specialist will tend to kind of stay in their lane and delegate. I'm not 100% sure if Alok was generalist or specialist, but I put him on the generalist side, which makes him a social one. That seems to be the best fit for him. He could also be a flex specialist. I'm not exactly sure on that, but I do believe he's most likely a flex generalist because he takes a lot of personal ownership and personal responsibility and has a strong sense of ownership of his projects, which is a trait of a generalist. So thank you both for joining today, and I think we should pick somebody for next week. Let's just go ahead and do Ra for next week. I think that would be a fun one, Ra Uruhu. I think that'll be a good comparison to Alok that we did today. And I mean, I'd love to do some women as well. I don't mean to not. So if there are any female figures in human design or in a related field that you'd like to type. Actually, yeah, maybe we should change it up. Maybe we should do Brandy next week to get some female representation. Let's do Brandy Jordan. We'll save Ra, although I do think it'll be fun to compare him to Alok because they both are such great teachers, but they have a very different approach. So let's save Ra. We'll do Brandy Jordan next week, and if anyone needs any videos, I guess you can probably watch some of the videos we have in the archive here on Signpost for her, and I imagine you both know her pretty well. So she will be the one that we type next week. Any comments, questions, anything at all you'd like to chat about? I mean, I know that was a lot of information to take in. I'm an information dominant person, so I tend to, not respect energy levels sometimes. Sometimes people are like, Jonah, you're really just blasting us with information here. Like, please slow down on the info. But I hope that wasn't too much information. But as an information dominant person, I tend to really orient myself towards sharing as much information as possible. Sometimes to the point where some of the information can get lost in the shuffle of it. But I hope that was, I hope that was good enough. So, okay, well, unless you have any comments, we'll just call it a day. But thank you for joining for the personality typology group. And if you would like, I think you should definitely submit to the cognitive resolution group. I think that'd be great. So, okay. Well, thank you, Nancy. Thanks for joining. And if you have energy, go for it. It's free, as mentioned. It's a pretty cool group. And I'll be curious to see what they say. And I'll make sure that I actually do have my type assessment of you. So I have that in my typing database so we can compare what results I got versus what results they get. And then what results you've gotten for yourself as well. And that'll be nice to cross-reference. So, all right. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.